This story comes from a good friend of mine who used to be in the Boy Scouts. To my knowledge, the events that take place in this story are 100% true. I will also leave a link in the description if you want to check out the article about this. This took place around 2015 when I was active in the Boy Scouts. Every summer, my troop would always travel to a camp known as Hidden Valley, located in rural Pennsylvania. It was a pretty nice camp. It had nice facilities, a pool, a river that went right through the camp, as well as many merit badge options for scouts to take. Despite this, the camp had a bad past as in 2007, a scout was killed in a terrible accident. This always created an eerie feeling for my troop as our campsite was around 100 feet his memorial. Anyway, that year I took 4 merit badges including wilderness survival. The final requirement for the merit badge involved building a temporary shelter and sleeping in it for one night. This was no problem for me. 3 other kids in my troops were also taking the merit badge test, so we all decided to make one big shelter. We strung up a rope between 2 large trees and then hung a tarp from a portable garage over it to create a homemade tent. Eventually, nightfall came, and we settled down in our sleeping bags. I was at the end of the tent, which meant I was positioned so I could see straight out of the large opening of the tent. The other scouts and I told stories for a little while, but after that, we fell asleep. Later in the night, I awoke to the sounds of sticks and small rocks being thrown at the tarp. At first, I thought they were acorns, but they came so fast. One hit the tarp at least every 2 or 3 seconds. I tried to play it off, but then I heard something that truly terrified me. A giggle came from outside the shelter. At this point, I turned to look out through the opening, and that is when I saw them. There were figures peering out from behind the trees. Maybe like 4 or 5 of them. They seemed to be aware that I was awake as they just stood there, staring directly at me. It almost felt like they were staring deep into my soul. Frozen in fear, I watched them continue to pop their heads out from behind the trees. I couldn't even move. It was like my body had locked up in terror, but eventually, I mustered up enough courage to roll over and tap the scout beside me on the shoulder. I kept trying to wake him up, but he wouldn't even move. It felt as if I was in some horrific nightmare that I couldn't even escape. After many attempts to wake him up, without trying to alert the shadow figures, I gave up. I rolled back over and tried to block out this horrific event, but I realized that the figures were no longer there. I looked and squinted my eyes, but I could not see them. Not only that, but the stone throwing had also come to a stop. Still being paranoid, I laid there awake for at least another hour, staring out into the deep darkness. I must have fallen asleep at some point in time because I later woke up to the birds chirping and the sun rays shining in my eyes. I played it off as though nothing happened the night before. To be completely honest, I thought it was just some sort of twisted nightmare. That was until, during breakfast, I heard my friend Josh say,
"Did you guys hear all those stones getting thrown at the cabins last night?"
Most of the troops agreed that something had occurred. I'm unsure of what happened on that ill-fated night, but I do know that I will never forget that experience, and I definitely won't be going back to those woods. Number 2. I'm a tall, yet extremely skinny guy, and I'm 21 years old. I was 20 years old at the time, and it was the week before the presidential election in the United States. I felt a lot of anxiety about the election, as I live in Manhattan, and there was a lot of crazy people in that city who act as if the entire world is going to end over one simple election. So feeling exhausted from both of that and my university, I decided to visit my friends in Moscow. I'm half Russian and have an apartment in the city center of Moscow. I have never been in Russia while it snowed, and luckily, during this time it was snowing. The city looked beautiful, and the vibe I had from the city was perfect. I felt so calm, safe, and the whole world around me just seemed so quiet. Unfortunately, I had severe jet lag and fell asleep around 5 p.m. Moscow time that day. My friend went home to get ready for her classes the next day, and I woke up around 3 a.m. I could not fall back asleep, so I decided to go outside and take a walk around my area while it calmly snowed. I walked around the dead, empty city in my district and took in all of the most beautiful architecture and snow falling down heavily. I don't remember for how long I was walking, but I crossed a bridge and entered deeply into a neighborhood I was not familiar with. I thought it would be okay, as I was in my district and sort of remembered the way back home. I eventually came up to this ginormous entrance of a block unit with a beautiful gate on it. The gate was opened, so I decided to step inside. It looked like a small little compound or something similar to it. If anyone is from Russia, they probably know what I am talking about. Everything was dead quiet, and the trees were canopied in the square complex. To the right was an extremely tall building with a ginormous door. I peeked inside and saw a lightly dimmed lobby with a blinking fluorescent light. I held on the door, and to my surprise it was unlocked. I entered into the massive building and looked around. I saw many stairs wrapping around in a square leading up, a small typical Russian elevator, and to the right of the stairwell stairs that led down, the door at the bottom of the stairs was open. I absolutely do not know what came over me, as I am not the one to adventure alone, but as I stated earlier, everything felt so beautiful. The quiet vibe of the snow-covered Russia had me feeling so peaceful, and I decided to just tiptoe on down into the basement to take a closer look. I walked into the room with the open door and threw on my flashlight on my phone. I saw an extremely long tunnel, and I could not see the end of it. I felt threatened by it for some reason, and I got extremely uncomfortable. I decided it was best for me to leave. When I turned around, the only light that was entering the tunnel was from outside of the doorway. I then saw standing in the doorway a black silhouette. I quickly understood it was the outline of a person who was at least 5 inches taller than me. So I would say he was about 6'5". He was massive, and my stomach jumped so hard with my heart beginning to beat super quickly. He started to speak to me in Russian, but as my Russian isn't fluent, I did not understand everything he said. "I'm sorry, I don't speak Russian," I said to him in Russian.
You speak English?
He said in English to me. I told him I did, and he asked me if I knew where I was. No, I told him, as my mind started to fill up with a lot of different scenarios, one of which, with me having to run down this tunnel and getting lost to avoid him if he chased me.
These tunnels used to be used for Red Army soldiers to move from one place to another during the war.
He explained to me.
This whole building used to be a bunker for Red Army soldiers.
I said, to show some interest, and began to move towards the left while facing him, in attempts to get him to move out of the doorway.
This whole place is now apartments. I have one on top of the floor. You should come see it.
He said to me. It's quite late, and I think I should be going, I said. However, he grabbed my small wrist with a lot of strength, and led me towards the stairs to go to the main floor of the lobby.
I have you love.
He called the small elevator. And if any of you have ever been to Russia, you'll know exactly what type of elevator it is. The type that can barely fit 2 people. He began telling me about how he just got back from Chicago, and that his husband loves Chicago as well. This started to have me panicking, as I thought to myself that there would be another man up there to where he was bringing me, and I would have 2 men overpower me. Once we go to his room, I looked at this massive studio apartment he had. He only had candles to light the room, with a lot of tapestries dividing it up, with both the candle and moonlight shining through it. Create a super eerie vibe. I looked out of his window as he instructed me, and I have to admit, the view was amazing. I got a panoramic view of the city and of the building. I then started scoping around, looking for an opportunity to get out of there. Where is your husband? I asked. He looked at me and laughed.
He's dead.
He then picked me up, and I asked him what he was doing. He brought me into another room and began to touch me inappropriately. He ran his hand down my back and took my phone from my back pocket. I did not realize he did this, as I was just in horror as this man licked me and said explicit things in Russian. I tried to pull away, but it made him squeeze and corner me even harder. After about 10 minutes of this, he told me to wait a moment. He went to his bathroom, and in this moment, I immediately sprinted over to the door. There were no lights, so I went to pull out my phone for the flashlight, only to my horror, the phone was missing from my back pocket. I almost nearly had a heart attack, as I realized I would have to go back into the bedroom to get my phone. I darted back into the room and saw my phone laying on the couch he had next to his bed. I grabbed it and ran for the door. I unlocked 2 locks on one door, and when I opened the one, there was an outer door. I managed to get it open. As I ran out, the adrenaline was so high in me. I ignored the elevator and went straight for the stairs. I ran around in circles down for what seemed like forever until I finally reached the bottom. I practically leaped down a few steps to go out of the lobby to the main door I had entered from. It wouldn't open as I pushed as hard as I could on it. I then began to start sobbing to myself and cursing. The thought of me having to go back into that tunnel to hide again from him came over me, and I almost began to accept that as a reality at this point. I quickly tried to pull myself together and noticed the typical button you should press to disable the magnet that holds the door locked. I pressed it, heard the monotone beep that follows, and fell out of the door and into the snow. I never understood why characters could not pull themselves together when running in horror movies, always falling on themselves. But in that moment, I did the same, and I sort of understand it now. I treaded through the thigh-high snow into the main road by exiting the complex. I sprinted, ignoring my lungs screaming for air down the main road. Only slowing down once, I reached a bridge that led me to my street. Once I got inside, I sat in my bed for 2 hours, nearly shaking before I told anyone about it.